this week we're going to kind of talk about what we want to see from the games. And this isn't really our predictions. This is more so in our perfect world, what do these next entries on Switch 2 look like? Because I think we're in a really interesting place where pretty much every major Nintendo franchise, the Nintendo Switch entry of it, there's someone out there that thinks it's the best in that series ever. It's just been an incredible generation for Nintendo's first party software. And I think that raises a lot of questions about how they're going to follow some of this stuff up in the next generation. So let's get started with the reason that this whole topic was kind of brainstormed, which is 3D Zelda, because I've been thinking about it the last week, and I've been wondering if anybody here is getting tired of the Breath of the Wild formula, because we've had two games now with it in the 3D style, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and I was thinking about it. It's only two games compared to the original 3D Zelda format's five games from Ocarina of Time to Skyward Sword, but I looked up the how long to beat times for those five games and just the two open world Zelda games. And essentially, we've been spending the same number of hours with both gameplay styles across those five games and these two much larger open world games. And then if I look at kind of the era of these two things, 1998 Ocarina of Time to 2011 Skyward Sword, that's 13 years. And then you look at Breath of the Wild 2017 to when's our best guess at when we might get the next big 3D mainline Zelda? 2028, 2029 maybe? That is 11 or 12 years. It's almost the same that this has been the status quo for Zelda as the old format was that people were definitely tired of by the time Skyward Sword rolled around. And I'm not necessarily saying I'm sick of it after Tears of the Kingdom, which is my favorite game of all time. But I think if the next 3D Zelda started and it is Link in a semi open starter area, you collect four godlike powers, and then you're unleashed on the larger open world where you have to go to four corners and you're collecting pieces of story out of order along the way, I feel like the cracks would start to show a little bit more than they even did with something like Tears of the Kingdom. So, Brian, I'll start with you. What do you want from the next 3D Zelda, and do you think they need to pivot into a new direction?
Um, that's a really, really tough one because I think that there's an entire new generation that just connects Zelda with the Tears of the Kingdom Breath of the Wild formula. And there's nothing wrong with that because they're awesome. And I think that underneath that is a lot of the sort of basis of why I love Zelda since I was a little kid, right? Even the original NES Zelda was like, go anywhere you want. You can use bombs on this enemy or fire on this enemy. Like there was a lot of creativity there, whereas a lot of the games of its era sort of funneled you into one specific design. But it just, these games were 7, 8 years apart, and I just don't think that's like a very tenable franchise future for Zelda. Like I think that like you got to keep the lights
Mhm.
on in some way. What you said about the 3D Zeldas is interesting because I think they were going really well, and then Skyward Sword was obviously when a lot of us were like, okay, I think I'm tired of this. But I think it was also because Skyward Sword had a lot of issues outside of that that made us sort of fatigued on the formula in general a bit. But again, it's been long enough now that like a return to that would be really awesome. So I do hope they find some sort of like smaller, bite-sized, like what does sort of Zelda's Shadow of Erdtree style thing look like, right? Like what is like a pretty big expansion for Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild, or like a even fully standalone thing. Like Shadow of the Erdtree required the base Elden Ring game to launch, but I'm wondering like what does something like that look like for Zelda? Like taking that 3D formula, making something that isn't necessarily 150 hours, but maybe like 30, 40, 50 hours, right? To 100%. And so that's what I would like. We just got a 2D Zelda last year, which I adored. I imagine they'll get another one of those going soon, probably a remake. It'd be I still want the Oracle of Ages and Seasons remakes in that engine. But yeah, I'm hoping they do a sort of like a smaller scale expansion that's also kind of standalone. Like take that Tears of the Kingdom formula and build something new that's got a couple of dungeons in it and kind of, keep the franchise going until the next big thing.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because even that 2D Zelda had a lot of tenets of that open air Breath of the Wild Tears of the Kingdom formula, and I
Hmm.
think that's actually something else that triggered this thought is that I didn't like Echoes of Wisdom as much as I think a lot of people did, and part of that I wonder is if it had come out before Tears of the Kingdom when this new style still felt more novel, would I have had a different take on it? So, Jada, I know that you are historically not a fan of the open world pivot for Zelda. So where are you at on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I listen. Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, fantastic, amazing games. Some of the best design games out there. Just magical. It fits on the Switch hardware. And I know there's a lot of huge fans and a lot of, like Brian said, only know these this is Zelda. This is Zelda for them. Some of them haven't gone back, may not have had a chance or just been able to experience Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword. I wasn't meaning to name them all, but they just kept coming. And so I I am okay if we get another if they do continue this trend. I just want them to bring back more of what made the previous era of Zelda, because these Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, they are Zelda in many ways, but they're also not Zelda in many ways. And so, like, we still haven't seen that true return to format for dungeons. I feel like music still hasn't played a big core part of the experience like we got with Wind Waker and Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Like, those games were all those games from the last era were very musically focused. And I don't know if it's just they're trying to do something different and they're trying to be, more about the ambience and the score for the music, because Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have fantastic scores and fantastic soundtracks, but they just didn't weave into the gameplay as much as I would have liked, as well as missing the dungeons. And I guess the core experience for me growing up as Zelda was the Ocarina of Time. It was the Link to the Past. It was the Oracle of Seasons, Ages, and those were very much go in a dungeon, beat a bunch of things, solve a bunch of puzzles, get a cool new gadget, and continue on. And I feel like with Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, they kind of front load you with a lot of the stuff, and then towards the end it's just, okay, can I get a better sword? What can I get? I can get a better spear. I can fuse this together now. I can use this ability to build this cool thing. But it's nuances on the same thing that you've already had for 40-50 hours, versus getting something new kind of piecemeal every 4 to 5 hours, if that makes sense. So I'd be happy if they made a swap. I don't know exactly what I would want that to be, other than the aforementioned back to dungeons. And I feel like I'm a broken record, and I know a lot of people are in that mindset, and it's a little obvious, but that is kind of the big thing. I want to go back to the previous era of Zelda games. I like those better.
Yeah, Reb, jump in here.
I think I kind of am just going to restate what Brian said a little bit. I'm not quite sure. I think this is a really difficult question. And Logan, you talked about total playtime when you were comparing this era of Zelda to the 3D games that came before. But you can compare the total playtime, but the reality is there were more games like in the previous era of Zelda. And so there were a lot more opportunities for Nintendo to iterate on what Ocarina of Time was. They did Majora's Mask, which is very, very different. Wind Waker was Wind Waker's open world. Like, this is Breath of the Wild is not the first. I mean, Ocarina of Time is really open world. Technically, it's
Legend
like
of
gated
Zelda
in
is
certain
open
ways.
world.
Yeah, the whole thing is really like it. And so I don't think that but then you have games like Twilight Princess that kind of aren't, like, in certain ways they're a little more linear and a little more directed. So the series has gone back and forth over the years. I think there's certain markers of it that remained true to Zelda in Breath of the Wild, as you said, Jada, and some things that deviated. What I would like to see is for them to play around in this space a little bit more with different types of deviations. So, like, I've said this on this podcast before, but I'm a huge Majora's Mask fan. I love it, and what I love about it is that they took Ocarina of Time, this incredible thing that they had established, and they shrunk it down into this really creative concept that took place over. I mean, you still had the different areas in the dungeons, but really that game was just so much smaller, just space wise and time wise too. I mean, it was the same 3 days, the same three like character movements and things over and over again, but you were learning more about them and piecing them together over time. I don't want them to do a Majora's Mask version of Breath of the Wild, but I would be interested in seeing what happens if you take the creativity and the agency that the player is given in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and found a way to condense that down into something that's really meticulous, like a clockwork thing where everything is like very detailed. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom deviate from the previous Zelda games, and that in I think pretty much every Zelda game before, the progression of those games is that you're Link, you have a sword, eventually you get a boomerang, and then you have to solve a bunch of puzzles with that boomerang, and then you get a bow and arrow, and now everything involves the boomerang and the bow and arrow. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom gives you basically your whole toolkit from the get-go, and everything is just how creative do you want to be, what kinds of things can you learn to do with these things we've given you. And so I want them to I did not like I agree with you, Logan. I didn't like Echoes of Wisdom as much as other Zelda games. I liked it a normal amount, but I'm glad it exists because I think it's a 2D Zelda game technically, but they were thinking along the same lines as Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, but sort of reshaping that creativity into a different format. And I want to see them do that with 3D Zelda for a little while. I don't know what that looks like or what that ends up being, but I would like to just sort of encourage them to kind of keep messing around in this space. I don't want to play Twilight Princess again. I don't want them to go back to the sort of linear progression based thing that they used to do. I don't mind if they bring back elements of older Zeldas, but I think we can hang out here for a little while. Oh, Red's showing Twilight Princess on screen to spite me.
I was going to say, does it feel like the toothpaste is sort of out of the tube with this stuff though? Like if they went back to just like the more linear, less like sort of puzzle focused, like you have a billion options to solve everything, would newer players be like, this is a step back?
I think it'd be hard to go back
because we just saw this happen. And I'm not an Assassin's Creed fan, but when Assassin's Creed Mirage was announced, I was very excited just about its existence because it was catering to those old style of fans of that series where it was more stealth focused and more linear and smaller scale and took place entirely within this city. And it was different than the 150-hour Assassin's Creed Valhalla or something like that. And that was such a cool direction for them to go. And then it didn't sell well. And it kind of was just a drop in the bucket, and that was it. And that was a bummer to me to see how that game performed because I was hoping it would kind of set the blueprint for other series to do this too, and for Zelda to do this too. And I do think that you just look at the sales numbers. Breath of the Wild plus Tears of the Kingdom is 50 million in sales. That is that dwarfs the entire rest of the series combined. It's not even really close. Like these two games are what Zelda is right now. And it's very impressive what they've done and how they have managed to reach an entirely new generation of people. But I look at it and I look at the Breath of the Wild to Tears of the Kingdom. And again, Tears of the Kingdom is my favorite game of all time. I played 180 hours of it and loved pretty much every second of it. But I look at what Eiji Aonuma and the team took from Breath of the Wild and what they really chose to focus in on, and it was the viral nature of Breath of the Wild. It was, look at this speed run, look at this trick shot, look at this person shooting a bomb arrow from across the map and killing a guardian in the sky all the way across Hyrule. And then they kind of almost legalized that in Tears of the Kingdom and gave you more tools and ways to do it. And I really like that aspect of it. That's a very fun element of these open world Zeldas, but it's not the only one. There's exploration that people loved about Breath of the Wild. There's so much else, I think, that was special about that game that you could explore in a sequel. And Aonuma's seeming obsession with complete freedom, I think, has come at the expense of other elements of the game, like linear storytelling. One of the biggest disappointing moments in Tears of the Kingdom is the first memory I found spoiled the big twist of the story, and I don't want to go through that again. I don't want to play the third open world Zelda 20 hours in, see a cutscene that's really the climax of the game, and I think that there's a way to maintain these elements of freedom, but tell a linear story. There's a way to maintain the things that Aonuma and Fujibayashi love about these games, but give us a hook shot and drip feed us items across the adventure. Instead of giving you your 4 powers and a tree branch at the start and saying, have fun, I think there's a way to almost do like a Mario Odyssey style of thing where it's huge open areas, and within those areas you can see that mountain and go to it. In that area you get a hook shot and you're zipping around walls and trees, but then there's a finite end to that area and you move on and you do it again. Because I think the Great Plateau is still my favorite part of Breath of the Wild, and it's the opening 3 or 4 hours. I still think it's just masterfully designed, and then after that the pacing starts to lose me. I think the longer you play an open world Zelda, the less interesting it gets, the less dangerous it gets. You've seen most of what there is to offer. And I think they need to find a way to capture that excitement, danger, and unknowing of the first 20 hours and extrapolate that across a 100-hour experience. I think that's the challenge they face for me.
I think that
I want to support like two of your points there, because I am a big defender of the storytelling of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I love the non-linear thing. I'm a weirdo like that. I agree with you that I don't want to do it again. Like it was good for me in those games. I don't want every Zelda game to just be like that. It's okay to tell a linear story more often than you don't. And I very much agree with you about the Great Plateau. I am a big fan of very tight game design where all the pieces just interlock perfectly. And the bigger you make something and the more freedom you give the player, the harder it is to do that. And I think that is why the Great Plateau is so great, is because there's so much anticipation of what the player is going to see and hone in on and choose. But the bigger it gets, the less predictable the player's path is. And at that point, you kind of just have to assume that anybody walking up to something either is seeing it for the very first time or is coming at it with all the most powerful swords and abilities and everything, and is at the end of the game, and try to curate an experience for both of them. And that's, I think, impossible. So yeah, I agree with you.
The one of the big things for me when it comes to open world games, because I spend a lot of time in open world games just kind of wandering, which is, a big part of those experiences. And thankfully Breath of the Wild fixed some of my issues with that, which is a lot of open world games run into, where you often go to the same places over and over again, not because like the story is directing you there. It was like, oh, I know how to get to this place, so I'm going this route to get there. And so you see the same things over and over again, because you don't know if going another route is going to take you there, or if you're going to take a 20-minute, detour and be like, oh, well, this is just a dead end. And, I found a chest over here with 20 rupees. Cool. They fixed that with like the, what is it called? Like the footprint tracking, the master path, I want to say is what it was called.
The Hero's Path?
In Breath of the Wild? Hero's Path. Thank you. And so thankfully they fixed that. That's one of those things. I love having those tools. So like, I think if they do continue to go around this formula, including more of those elements, that way it can help kind of players like me who get stuck in a rut of just going to the same places and seeing the same things and over again, hoping to see something new. Like if I take this one turn, I don't know. It's a weird problem. It's very much a Jada problem, I think, but that's just one of those things for me, is when I play open world games, I notice I often see the same things over and over again. And I think that's when my interest starts to weigh on me. And that's partially on me because I don't take other routes, but it's because I'm trying to be efficient and get to where I need to go as fast as possible. But at the same time, that means I also miss out on seeing different things sometimes. So
No,
very
it's
much a me
definitely-
problem.
I don't think it's just a you problem. I think it's like every open world needs to sort of drip feed you surprise and discovery and delight and challenge and reward. And like I've been playing a lot of the Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and I just played Origins. I was just looking for like a big open world game to play, and just seeing the little question marks pop up and walking towards them and being like, oh, it's a whole fort or it's a whole camp, and my reward is a new sword. Maybe I need it. Maybe I'll sell it. Maybe I'll junk it and turn it into upgrade rocks or whatever you use in that game, just just silly currency. But like the thing is with open world games is that everybody has a different journey through them, and like Logan's is unfortunate because it's like you got a big story beat spoiled early on. I had something similar with Tears of the Kingdom. It didn't like wreck the game for me, but it did sort of like the way it told that sort of narrative out of order didn't necessarily work for me. But I did love the fact that 40, 50 hours in, I was still finding new creatures to pick fights with, and I was finding way over leveled enemies and cool new weapons and items, and just like there was a lot of surprise and discovery in that game. And what's weird about Tears of the Kingdom, going off of what Reb was saying, is that it sort of is Breath of the Wild's Majora's Mask, in that it took a bunch of pre-existing assets and an engine, and it built a brand new game on it that's a little darker and a little weirder. But it didn't do what Majora's Mask did, in that it like totally reinvented things. Like it's quite literally the same Hyrule. There's obviously new layers to it, or tiers, I guess, in the title. But it's ultimately like, I don't want to be reductive and be like it's Breath of the Wild DLC, because I hated when people called it that. But it is the same Hyrule, right? And there's some changes here and there. It didn't feel like Ocarina to Majora's Mask feel like a massive A, tonal shift, and B, like just a whole new place. to be, new characters and all of that. And so that's, we got a bit of that with Tears of the Kingdom, but ultimately, like, it was them saying, we're building on a foundation and a formula that was immensely successful. We're going to give you more of it. We're going to give you bigger, you're going to have more options, and all the Zonai devices was like their new way of saying, hey, you have all these new, this is a whole new, similar sandbox, new toys to play with, basically. And so, yeah, I'm with you all in that, like, it's sort of in a difficult spot. And I feel like a lot of Nintendo franchises are kind of there right now. Like, some of them have reached this pinnacle of scope and scale where you're like, you've maybe bottlenecked yourself into this situation where how do you get bigger than the last Smash Brothers, right? Like, how do you get bigger than the last Animal Crossing, which had so many massive quality of life improvements and finally overhauled so many things that were stagnant in that franchise for so long? And I still love them. And so, yeah, I think what we're seeing with Zelda, at least, is that it's alternating between the smaller ones and the bigger ones. And their version of the Assassin's Creed Mirage is that they'll give you a 2D Zelda game every couple of years. And I'm cool with that. But I do think that, like, they need to find some way to be like, how do we get a 3D Zelda game out for people who love those things, but it doesn't take 7-8 years, right? That's the big puzzle to solve. Man, I loved all the dragon stuff in this game. The end of this game.
I love watching this footage. Oh my gosh.
Awesome.
Love
to be clear, like, I think there's been a lot of Tears of the Kingdom backlash in the last year or so. That's just kind of how the cycle of these things goes. Super, super hype, and then we bottom out, everyone turns on it, and then we balance out at some point. This conversation is not part of that. I adore Tears of the Kingdom. I love it. This isn't me turning on these two games. I wouldn't change anything about the last two games. Well, maybe a couple things, but like, largely, I love them so much. And I'm just looking ahead and thinking, I think Tom Marks nailed it in his review of Tears of the Kingdom. He said that Tears of the Kingdom makes Breath of the Wild feel like a first draft. And I think that's exactly it. It's not Breath of the Wild DLC, but it is a second draft of what Breath of the Wild was. I just want the next Zelda to be a third draft, is essentially what I'm getting at here. I think that the best thing Breath of the Wild did for the open world genre as a whole was take off the markers on the map and make you make your own markers and find them yourselves. That is the key thing it did that I think differentiated it from something like an Assassin's Creed that vomits 1,000 icons on your map, which I'm personally not a fan of. Just take that and do something different with it. And I think that's really what I'm getting at is, I don't think it's dungeons. I'm not sure that we ever get something as cool as the dungeons in Ocarina through Twilight Princess again. I just kind of feel like that juice is gone. I'd love to be proven wrong, but I think it's something else at this point. I don't know what it is, but I'm excited to find out. I just hope that they just maybe fall a little bit out of love with this concept of unparalleled freedom, dial that back a little bit to let some other aspects of the game shine. And I can't wait to see what it is.